Hannah, the Condemned Child. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivian. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Author's note. This work is deeply personal for me. I live with disabilities, and I move through the world with an awareness, every day, of how quickly people make assumptions about capacity, credibility, and appropriate behavior. I know what it is to need accommodations. I know what it is to be misread. And I know how damaging it can be when institutions treat difference as defiance. There is also a private irony here. Dyslexia, in particular, can feel like being asked to build a life out of letters that won't sit still. To write with dyslexia is to keep showing up anyway, to draft, revise, recheck, and keep going while the page fights back. That stubborn persistence is part of what makes this project possible, and part of what makes it matter. A note on disability, diagnosis, and dignity. You may see references in historical material to people being simple, idiotic, mad, feeble-minded, deaf and dumb, hysterical, or other terms that are cruel, imprecise, and deeply loaded. I do not use these words as my own. When they appear, it is to show how a person was described by authorities of the time, and to examine what that description allowed the system to do to them. I also want to be clear about what I won't do. I won't diagnose historical figures. Disability and neurodivergence are real, and they matter to how someone experiences the world, but we cannot ethically confirm someone's condition from a hostile record. What we can do is pay attention to documented behavior, circumstances, and the way institutions responded, especially when those responses look like punishment for traits that today would prompt care, assessment, or accommodation. A note on race, ethnicity, and colonial records. In many pre-Edwardian cases, identity is recorded through the lens of colonial power. People may be categorized inconsistently, or reduced to slurs and legal labels. In Hannah Ocuish's story, for example, different sources use different racial terms, and those choices are not neutral. They are part of how the era justified control and exclusion. When I discuss identity, I do so carefully, using respectful language, acknowledging uncertainty, and recognizing that the record may not reflect how a person understood themselves. A note on victims and families. Behind every dramatic headline is a real person who suffered, and real families who carried that loss. This book does not exist to re-hurt them. When I describe violence, I keep detail purposeful and proportionate. You will not find lingering cruelty here, only what is necessary to understand what happened, what was claimed to have happened, and how the system responded. Reader care and content notes. Some chapters involve the death of children, sexual violence, coercion, domestic abuse, forced labor, colonial violence, and execution. I include content notes where needed, and I encourage you to read in the way that best supports your well-being. Skipping a section is not failing as a reader, it is an act of care. If you are reading this with your own lived experience of disability, trauma, marginalization, or institutional harm, I want you to know, you are not alone in how you might feel while moving through these pages. I wrote this with you in mind too, with a commitment to respect, to care, and to telling the truth as faithfully as the record allows. Preface. There is a particular cruelty in how the past can speak with such confidence. In Hannah Ocuish's case, most of what survives was written about her, not by her, court summaries, community accounts, and an execution sermon produced for public consumption. These aren't neutral documents. They were shaped by fear, grief, moral certainty, and the need to justify an outcome that even then unsettled people. A child was punished as if she were an adult, and the official record worked hard to make that feel inevitable. This book returns to Hannah alone. Some names in these pages have become legends. Others were barely allowed to be human on the page at all, reduced to a sentence in a court ledger, a sensational pamphlet, or a minister's moral warning. My aim is not to flatten anyone into a trope. I'm not interested in monsters, and I'm not interested in making harm entertaining. I'm interested in what happens when a society decides a woman, or a child, is disposable, and then writes that decision into the official story. A special care is required when the accused is young. Cases involving children and teenagers, like Hannah Ocuish, sit at the intersection of grief, fear, and spectacle. They force us to look directly at how quickly communities can reach for punishment, how easily a narrative can be fixed in place, and how rarely the systems of the time paused to ask whether a child understood what was happening to them. In these stories, there are always victims, and there is always loss. There is also often an accused person whose life was shaped by neglect, exploitation, racism, disability, or all of the above. Holding those truths together is difficult. It is also necessary. Chapter 1: Behind the Old Meeting House. Content note: this chapter discusses the death of a child and the execution of a child. Violence is referenced without lingering detail. On December 20th, 1786, a crowd gathered behind New London's Old Meeting House to watch a hanging. The condemned was a child. The day had a shape the town already understood: a public punishment, a public lesson, and a public record that would outlive the body. In this case, the lesson arrived as a printed sermon, God admonishing his people of their duty, as parents and masters, preached on the morning of the execution and published soon after. Its title tells the reader what the pamphlet intends to do: instruct adults, reinforce authority, and frame what is about to happen as both necessary and righteous. In the title, the girl is named and categorized in the same breath: Hannah Ocuish, a mulatto girl, aged 12 years and 9 months. The victim is also named and measured: Eunice Bowles, aged 6 years and 6 months. The arithmetic of innocence sits there in plain type. 2 children, reduced to months. This is the first problem the case presents. The surviving story is not a single story. It is a set of documents written for particular purposes: mourning, warning, justification, reassurance. The pamphlet does not pretend to be a court transcript. It is closer to a public narrative designed to settle the town's nerves and reassert the moral order after something that threatened to unmake it. Even when it supplies particulars, it does so while guiding the reader towards a conclusion. The crowd behind the meeting house did not need reminding that a child had died. Grief does not require a sermon. What the crowd needed, what the pamphlet offered, was certainty that the right person had been found, that the punishment fit, that authority could still protect the community. The girl in the title. Hannah's identity appears in conflicting forms across the record. The sermon labels her mulatto. In the pamphlet's appendix, her mother is described as one of the Pequot tribe of Indians. These labels are not simply descriptors. They are part of how 18th-century New England sorted people into social categories that carried real consequences: who could be believed, who could be protected, who could be forgiven, who could be punished without public discomfort. The pamphlet claims Hannah was born at Groton. It presents an early life sketch that is less biography than prosecution, an argument that the child in the dock has always been dangerous, that the outcome is not tragic but inevitable. In that appendix, the narrative reaches back to an incident said to have occurred when Hannah was about 6, an attempted robbery involving another child, introduced with the assertion that she discovered the maliciousness and cruelty of her disposition early in life. The account is designed to harden the reader. It makes sure no sympathy grows in the wrong direction. The same pages describe local officials deciding to bind the children out, a common practice, part punishment and part social management, used to place poor or difficult children into other households as labor. The pamphlet also offers a portrait of Hannah's mother as a woman marked by addiction and abandonment, written in language that is openly contemptuous. That contempt matters, because the mother's supposed failure is used to explain the daughter's fate. The system condemns the parent, then condemns the child, then calls the result protection. Whether every detail is accurate is less certain than the pamphlet pretends. What is clear is the purpose. Hannah is placed outside the circle of the properly raised, outside the circle of the teachable, outside the circle of the salvageable. When a child is written as irredeemable, the rope can be presented as caution rather than catastrophe. The road from New London to Norwich. The appendix turns from background to the event itself. On the 21st of July, 1786, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, the body of the murdered child was found in the public road leading from New London to Norwich, lying on its face near to a wall. The details are vivid: stones placed on the body, bruising described, signs of strangulation noted. The language is intended to do 2 things at once: to shock and to convince. It establishes that this was not a misadventure, not an accident, not a moment of carelessness. It was murder. It was deliberate. The horror is positioned as proof. Then the pamphlet provides the town's response. The neighborhood were immediately engaged in making search and inquiry for the murderer. This is the second problem the case presents. In a small community, search and inquiry is never neutral. It is carried by relationships, resentments, fears, and assumptions, about class, about race, about who is likely to do harm, and who is likely to be protected from suspicion. The pamphlet says Hannah attempted to deflect blame, claiming she saw 4 boys near the place where the child was found, and that she heard the wall fall down. It frames this as usual habitual deceit, rather than a frightened child trying to survive questioning. The tone is important. It does not allow for panic. It does not allow for confusion. It does not allow for misunderstanding. It allows only for guilt. When the boys cannot be found, suspicion turns towards Hannah. The pamphlet moves quickly. On the 22d, she was closely questioned, but repeatedly denied that she was guilty. Then comes a scene that, in any modern reader, should set alarms ringing. She was then carried to the house where the body lay, and being again charged with the crime, burst into tears and confessed. The pamphlet presents this as truth arriving at last. It does not present it as pressure. It does not consider the effect of confrontation, fear, authority, and isolation, especially on a child. It does not consider how easily a confession can be shaped when the questioners already believe they know the answer. What the confession is made to do. The appendix states that Hannah offered the victim a piece of calico to draw her close, struck her with a stone, then strangled her when she stirred, and laid stones to create the appearance of an accident. It adds a motive, revenge for a complaint made in strawberry time, for taking away her strawberries. These details have been repeated in retellings for more than 2 centuries because they are narratively satisfying. Bait, attack, staging, motive. A neat arc. A morality play. Yet the same document also reveals how constructed the arc is. The confession is not presented as a verbatim statement. It is presented as a sequence of particulars that appeared in the course of the trial. The words have already passed through other mouths before reaching print. They have been translated into the pamphlet's moral vocabulary. They have been arranged to support the pamphlet's argument that this was deliberate revenge and cruelty with scarcely a parallel in any civilized country. That sentence, its certainty, its broad sweep, its heavy emphasis on civilization, does cultural work. It positions Hannah not only as guilty, but as an aberration so extreme that the town must respond with extreme force. It reassures readers that mercy would be weakness. It suggests that pity itself is dangerous. The pamphlet continues into character analysis. Hannah is said to have been marked by theft and lying, feared by neighborhood children, possessed of cunning and sagacity beyond many of her years. Again, the direction is clear. This is not merely a case about what happened to Eunice Bowles. It is also a case about how the community understood, and feared, the child they called Hannah. The court and the tears. The appendix states that Hannah pleaded not guilty at the direction of her counsel. It describes her demeanor during trial as entirely unconcerned. It describes observers, spectators, and the Chief Justice, moved to tears while the girls scarcely attend ed. The language is meant to alarm. It paints emotional mismatch as proof of moral defect. A child not weeping in the expected way becomes monstrous. Yet this is another place where the record needs to be read carefully. The pamphlet's author is not a clinician, and the era had little interest in disability as a call for care. A child can be unconcerned for many reasons: dissociation, misunderstanding, shock, fear, the inability to process, the inability to perform the correct social script under scrutiny. The pamphlet does not explore any of these possibilities. It does not need to. Its goal is not to understand the child. Its goal is to instruct the adults. It also describes fluctuations in Hannah's distress, uneasy at first in prison, later contented and happy, then in the final fortnight, increasingly frightened, crying for days before the execution. The text even notes that some people encouraged her, by saying she would not be hanged. The sentence lands as an aside, but it opens a door onto a different story, a child surrounded by rumors, grasping at hope, unable to comprehend that the adults had decided the outcome long before the last day arrived. A public ending. Connecticut history preserves a later account of that final walk. Hannah appeared greatly afraid, and seemed to want somebody to help her. The pamphlet itself uses almost the same phrasing at the end of the appendix, and adds one small human detail. At the place of execution, she thanked the sheriff for his kindness. Then the pamphlet turns the page. He passed into that state which never ends. The sentence is tidy. It is meant to close the case. It is meant to leave the reader with the feeling that the moral account is settled. But the scene behind the meeting house cannot be made tidy. A child's death does not become less disturbing because it is wrapped in scripture. A crowd does not become less culpable because it is told it is learning a lesson. A confession does not become automatically reliable because it is printed, structured, and repeated. What remains, at the start of this book, is a set of hard facts anchored in print: the date, the place, the ages, the body found on the road, the questioning, the carried child, the tears, the confession as the pamphlet frames it, the death that followed. Around those facts is a larger truth that will not sit still. The record was built to persuade. Chapter 2, Strawberry Time. Content note: this chapter discusses the death of a child. Violence is referenced without lingering detail. July in coastal Connecticut could be bright enough to look innocent. In the summer of 1786, the road between New London and Norwich carried ordinary traffic. People walking, carts, children sent on errands, children sent to school. This was a world that expected children to move through it without much protection. Childhood existed, but it was not sheltered. A child might be watched closely one day and left to manage alone the next, depending on work, weather, and the patience of adults who were already tired. Eunice Bowles was 6. On the morning she disappeared, she was doing something that should not have been dangerous, heading along a familiar route, within a community that liked to think it knew its own. When she did not arrive, the absence itself became a siren. In small places, a missing child is not a private worry for long. It becomes everyone's problem, everyone's fear, everyone's urgent business. By mid-morning, the search had a direction. People looked along the road. They scanned the edges, brush, ditches, the places where children might slip to pick berries or chase a distraction. When the body was found near a wall, the community's fear did what fear often does. It hardened into certainty that someone had done this. Not an accident. Not a fall. Not misadventure. Someone had chosen it. Once the word murder is spoken aloud, the next question arrives quickly: who? The search for a murderer in 1786 was not forensic. It was social. It ran on talk, reputation, proximity, and the invisible map of who belonged and who did not. It relied on the community's existing story about itself: who was trustworthy, who was troublesome, who was watched. This is where Hannah enters the record. The surviving accounts place her close enough to the scene to be questioned early. Exactly how that proximity was established is not always clear. Whether she was seen, whether she was known to be nearby, whether suspicion was already waiting for a reason. A child like Hannah, poor, unsettled, living under adult control that was not necessarily kind, marked by racialized labels in the documents, could be both visible and unprotected. The kind of child adults noticed when something went wrong. The kind of child adults believed they already understood. The narrative that follows depends heavily on a confession, and the way that confession is described matters. The questioning did not begin in a quiet room with a trained advocate. It began in a community in shock. Hannah is described as denying guilt at first. Then, according to the printed account, she was taken to the place where Eunice's body lay. Only then did she break and confess. A confession extracted from a child after confrontation like that is a fragile thing. It can be truth, it can be compliance, it can be panic, it can be an attempt to stop the questioning, it can be a child repeating what she senses adults want to hear. In a world where adults held absolute power, where a child could be bound out, moved, punished, or abandoned by decision, there were strong incentives to appease authority. The record does not treat the confession as fragile. It treats it as proof. It supplies a motive that is almost painfully small: strawberry time. A dispute about taking fruit. A complaint. A moment of childhood meanness, or a moment of adult scolding, turned into the stated seed of revenge. The detail is repeated because it offers a simple moral: petty greed and resentment become deadly when left unchecked. It turns an incomprehensible event into something tidy enough to preach about. And it shifts attention away from harder questions. What was Hannah's life, actually, in the weeks before July? Who was responsible for her day-to-day? Who watched her? Who fed her? What did she understand about punishment, about lying, about pleasing adults? What had she already learned about being believed, or not believed, when she spoke? The pamphlet gives a sketch: a child born in Groton, moved between households, attached to a mother described in harsh, contemptuous language. It describes an intention by local authorities to bind the children out, a practice that sat somewhere between welfare, labor arrangement, and control. Binding out was often spoken of as rescue, taking children from bad influence, giving them structure. In practice, it could also be a way of removing inconvenience from sight and turning childhood into service. In that system, a child's consent was irrelevant. Hannah's autonomy is hard to locate in any part of the record. She is acted upon. She is placed. She is questioned. She is carried. She is described. Even the language used to categorize her, terms that do not match cleanly across sources, signals that she was not simply a girl. She was a girl whose identity could be used against her, whose difference could be treated as evidence, whose lack of status could make harshness easier. Once Hannah was identified as the accused, the community narrative tightened. The printed account is keen to establish that she was not merely implicated in one terrible act, but that she was that kind of person, habitually deceitful, already feared, already corrupt. This is a familiar move in cases where evidence is thin or uncomfortable. If a person can be made to seem innately wicked, the need to prove each step of the accusation becomes less urgent. The story becomes about character rather than facts. Yet Hannah was 12. 12 is old enough to be punished in that era, but it is also young enough to be easily led, easily frightened, easily overwhelmed, and easily misunderstood. A child might appear calm and be in shock. A child might appear indifferent and be dissociating. A child might appear cunning because she has learned early to survive adults who are not safe. The record reads these possibilities as moral failure rather than human response. After the confession, the machinery began to move. Hannah was taken into custody. She was held. Adults debated what she understood and what she deserved. There are hints, even in the printed narrative, that people were unsettled by her age, unsettled enough to look for ways to explain her, label her, place her outside normal childhood. The pamphlet's tone performs certainty, but the very fact a sermon was printed and circulated suggests anxiety underneath. The community needed persuading. The adults needed a frame strong enough to hold what they were about to do. In prison, the record reports fluctuations in Hannah's state, distress, then composure, then rising fear as the execution date approached. Whatever the truth of the pamphlet's interpretation, the arc is believable in one stark way: a child does not hold a steady understanding of an adult world's intentions. Hope can return suddenly. Rumors can sound like promises. Denial can feel like safety. There is also a detail that lands like a quiet indictment. At some point, people told her she would not be hanged. Whether that was kindness or cruelty is difficult to measure. It could have been an attempt to soothe the child. It could have been ordinary gossip. It could have been deliberate comfort offered without power to make it real. It could have been the town itself unable to look directly at what it was doing, needing a story, any story, that made the ending seem less inevitable. The problem with comfort built on falsehood is that it collapses at the scaffold. By the time the case reached court, Hannah's voice, if it was ever heard in full, was already filtered through adults. The plea entered in her name, the account of her demeanor, the descriptions of what she seemed to feel, all of it belongs to observers. It is possible she did not understand the choreography. It is possible she understood too much. The record leaves the reader with impressions, not inner life. This chapter returns to July because July is where the road forks. On one side is the death of Eunice Bowles, a loss that cannot be undone and should not be minimized. On the other side is the capture of Hannah Ocuish, the tightening of suspicion into certainty, the conversion of a frightened child into a public symbol. Between the two sits the community, searching, grieving, and deciding in real time what kind of story it needed this to become. Chapter 3: A Child Bound to Other People. Content note: this chapter discusses child neglect, coercive labor arrangements, racism in historical records, and the lead-up to a child's execution. Violence is not described in detail. There is not much that survives about Hannah Ocuish's early life that can be treated as firm fact. What exists is mostly a story told after the outcome was already decided, a printed account that works backwards from a hanging, selecting details that make the ending feel earned. It offers a background, but it reads less like a childhood and more like an argument. Even so, it is the closest thing to an outline of her upbringing that remains in the public record, and it is difficult to write about Hannah without passing through the narrow gate of that document. The account places her birth in Groton and anchors her identity in labels that shift between sources. One part names her with a racial category, another describes her mother as Pequot. The inconsistency is not a small clerical issue. It is a reminder that the record did not belong to Hannah. It belonged to the people who classified her, and classification was never neutral. In that world, A child's identity could become a kind of evidence before any crime was proved. A childhood with no fixed home. The surviving narrative suggests instability as a defining feature of Hannah's early years. It portrays her mother as unreliable and ruined in the moral language of the time, leaning on the familiar colonial script of the unfit indigenous mother. Whether the details are accurate in full is hard to test now, but the function of the portrait is plain. It gives the community a reason to treat the child as already lost. There is a second function too. If the mother can be made into a cautionary figure, then the child can be presented as the natural result of that caution. The story becomes heredity, contagion, inevitability. It becomes something the town can manage with discipline rather than something it must meet with care. The most practical detail embedded in the record is also the most revealing: the intention to bind children out. Binding out was not unusual. It was a tool used to manage poverty and social disorder, a way of placing children into other households as workers in training. In idealized language, it could be described as rescue or guidance. In practice, it often meant a child was transferred into someone else's control because the community did not want to carry the cost of feeding them, and because a child without status could be made useful. In that arrangement, the child's wishes did not matter. If Hannah was moved between households, it would explain certain silences in the record. Children like her rarely left behind letters, school reports, or personal testimony. Their lives were conducted inside other people's kitchens, barns, and back rooms, where record-keeping was not a priority and where the child's interior life was not treated as information worth preserving. A child who belongs nowhere learns quickly what adults reward, what adults punish, and how to read a room before it turns dangerous. This is not sentiment. It is survival logic. The problem of character. The record also reaches back to an incident said to have occurred when Hannah was about 6, a story involving another child, a theft attempt, and violence. It is presented as an early sign of a disposition already set. This kind of retrospective anecdote is common in moralizing crime literature. Once a community has decided someone is wicked, it becomes easy, almost comforting, to find earlier moments that can be rearranged into a neat foreshadowing. The past is edited to match the ending. That does not mean the story is invented. It means it arrives through a filter, and the filter is motivated. The same document that claims this early incident also insists that Hannah was feared by neighborhood children and known for lying and theft. This is the language of social contagion. It frames a poor child as a threat to other children, which makes adult harshness feel protective rather than punitive. A child described as contagious can be isolated without guilt. It is also worth noticing what the record does not do. It does not ask why a child might steal. It does not ask what hunger looks like in a household that is strained. It does not ask what happens to a child who is passed around as a burden. It names cunning where another lens might see vigilance, and it names malice where another lens might see unregulated fear. The 18th century did not have the language for trauma or disability in the way the present does, and it often responded to difference with moral judgment. That absence matters, because the record's certainty about Hannah's nature is treated as though it were diagnosis. It is not. It is an interpretation, written by people with power, in a period that liked its children obedient and its marginalized children invisible. Education, the silence is the point. There is no clear evidence of Hannah's education in the surviving materials most commonly cited. No school attendance records are usually discussed in retellings, and nothing in the primary moral narrative lingers on learning in any ordinary sense. That silence is not surprising. Schooling in late 18th century New England was uneven. Education might exist in seasonal bursts, shaped by household labor demands, church instruction, and whether a family could spare a child from work. For a child bound out, training often meant practical service: how to scrub, carry, mend, mind younger children, obey. Literacy might be taught if a household valued it or if religious instruction demanded it, but it was not guaranteed. For a child whose identity was treated as socially marginal, the expectation of education could be even thinner. If Hannah could read or write, the record does not use that fact to humanize her. If she could not, the record would not have treated that as a failure of the system. It would have treated it as further proof she sat outside the circle of proper childhood. This is the central difficulty in writing Hannah's early life. The sources that survive were not interested in preserving her personhood. They were interested in preserving the lesson. Placed, rather than raised. The document's brief references to Hannah's living arrangements suggest she was left in a household near New London. The language matters. It does not say she was welcomed, adopted, or cared for. It suggests she was deposited. A child who is deposited becomes a problem to manage. That management can look outwardly ordinary: chores, rules, sleep, meals, church. It can also include neglect, contempt, or quiet cruelty. The record does not provide enough detail to prove what Hannah experienced inside the walls of any particular house. What it does show is the broader structure. Hannah existed under adult authority without the protection of belonging. A child like that can be corrected endlessly and still not become good, because good was often defined as ease of handling, compliance, gratitude, quietness, not taking up space. Hannah, at least in the way she is described, took up space. The record calls that a moral failure. It never pauses to consider that taking up space might have been the only way she could keep herself alive. The making of an accused child. By July 1786, Hannah was around 12. If the age given at the execution is close to accurate, she would have been born roughly in early 1774. In a modern frame, 12 is unthinkably young to be treated as fully criminally responsible. In the 18th century legal frame, it sat in a gray zone, still child, but capable of being punished as though older if the court deemed the child sufficiently aware of wrongdoing. Awareness, in that context, was often judged by adult expectation rather than by child reality. The record's insistence on Hannah's cunning and sagacity becomes useful here. It does not just paint her as unpleasant. It paints her as legally eligible for the full weight of punishment. The idea that she was unusually knowing serves a practical purpose. It smooths the moral discomfort of executing a child. The story of her upbringing is folded into that purpose. A rough child becomes an inevitable criminal. A child passed between houses becomes a child who cannot be guided. A child marked as socially marginal becomes a child easier to fear. All of it forms a scaffold beneath the scaffold. What can be added, and what must be left open? There is enough to sketch the shape of Hannah's world, but not enough to speak with certainty about her inner life. It is possible to add context without inventing detail. The likely instability of her home life, as suggested by the record's description of her mother and the mention of being left in others' care. The practice of binding out, and what it meant for children whose poverty or behavior made them inconvenient. The probable limits of education for a working child with low social standing. The racialized categorization in the sources, and how that could influence suspicion, credibility, and punishment. The way moralising literature builds character to justify legal outcomes. What cannot be responsibly added is a tidy biography, favorite places, personal habits, a clear schooling experience, affectionate relationships, or a stable timeline of who raised her. None of that is securely present in the surviving material most often used to tell this story. And that absence is part of the tragedy. A child's life is reduced to what adults found useful: misbehavior, fear, accusation, punishment. The ordinary parts of her childhood, play, hunger, illness, small kindnesses, the texture of her days, are not recorded because they were not considered worthy of record. The silence is not a gap in research alone. It is a feature of the historical world that produced the documents. The lead up to court. The record implies that after the confession, Hannah was held and watched while the community prepared to formalize what it already believed. In that period, there would have been time for talk to calcify into consensus, for rumors to harden, for any remaining doubts to be treated as weakness. In such conditions, a child becomes doubly trapped by the accusation, and trapped by the community's need for a clear answer. If Hannah had been a child with a stable family, with advocates, with social standing, the trajectory might have looked different. That is not a claim of innocence or guilt. It is a claim about how power shapes outcomes. The record itself shows how quickly Hannah was positioned outside sympathy, and how effectively her background was used to keep her there. Chapter 4. The Honorable Superior Court. Content note: this chapter discusses the death of a child, the prosecution of a child, and the lead-up to a child's execution. It includes references to confinement and court proceedings. Violence is not described in detail. The record says grand jury before it says child. Before Hannah is presented as a person, she is presented as a problem that has been processed. Her earlier life is introduced as particulars that were represented in evidence before the grand jury, and later as conduct appeared in evidence before the Honorable Superior Court. The phrasing is administrative, almost tidy. A life is turned into admissible material. This is how the case begins to harden. A murder involving a prominent family's child does not remain a private tragedy for long. It becomes a public wound. It creates a need for certainty, and then a need for an ending that feels like control. The superior court is where the community's need becomes a verdict. What survives from that courtroom is not a full transcript, and not a neutral account. What survives is a shaped story, told after the fact, with the outcome already set in ink. Even so, there are moments in the surviving narrative that refuse to stay neat. One of them is the plea. According to the printed account, when Hannah was arraigned at the bar, she pleaded not guilty at the direction of her counsel. It is a small detail, easily skimmed, but it changes the shape of the scene. A child stands before adult power and repeats words chosen for her. Whether she understood the strategy behind them is unknown. Whether she understood what a plea meant in practice is also unknown. The record is not curious about her understanding. It is only interested in procedure being satisfied. The record is more interested in her face. During the trial, it says, she appeared entirely unconcerned. It frames this as unnatural. It frames it as chilling. It frames it as character evidence, even though character is not evidence and demeanor is not a reliable measure of comprehension. In a case involving a 12-year-old, especially a 12-year-old described elsewhere as ignorant, stupid, or otherwise deficient, this fixation on the performance of emotion is more revealing than it intends to be. The courtroom is full of adults who know the script. The accused child is expected to look frightened in the right way, to look remorseful in the right way, to look attentive in the right way, to behave as a miniature adult. When she does not, the record does not consider shock, confusion, or dissociation. It calls the mismatch proof that something is wrong inside her, something fixed, something unteachable. That judgment matters because the trial does not appear to have rested on abundant physical proof. The story that survives leans heavily on confession obtained after questioning, and after bringing the child into the presence of the victim's body. In that environment, the confession becomes more than evidence. It becomes the hinge on which everything turns. And once a confession is the hinge, the rest of the case can be built around it like timber around a frame. The particulars printed in the appendix are presented as though they move straight from Hannah's mouth to the page: the brook, the road, the wall, the calico, the stones. But the record itself admits the details appeared in the course of the trial. That is not a verbatim statement. It is an account already handled by other people's language, questioners, officials, clergy, before it reaches print. This is not an argument that the confession is false. It is an argument that the confession, as presented, cannot be treated as a transparent window into a child's mind. It is a text built for adult purposes, and it is delivered to the public as moral theatre. The law itself, in theory, had a story about children. Under the English common law tradition, childhood sat inside a doctrine of incapacity. A child under 7 was presumed incapable of crime. A child between 7 and 14 was presumed incapable unless the prosecution could show the child understood the wrongfulness of the act. The presumption could be rebutted, but the presumption existed because childhood was recognized as a different kind of mind. In practice, a community determined to punish could treat the presumption as an inconvenience. The printed account works hard to show Hannah as unusually knowing, artful, cunning, with sagacity beyond many of her years. It is not hard to see what that language achieves inside a courtroom. It pushes her upwards, out of the category of child, into the category of creature who knows better and therefore deserves adult consequence. At the same time, other parts of the record lean on the opposite image: extreme ignorance, stupidity, lack of instruction. The contradiction is never resolved because it does not need to be resolved. Each description is useful at a different stage. Cunning helps justify conviction. Ignorance helps justify the sermon's broader warning to parents and masters. The child can be portrayed as both, depending on which message is needed. What is missing from the surviving story is any sign that Hannah's capacity was tested in a way that modern readers would recognize. There is mention, in later retellings, that people questioned her fitness to stand trial because of disability, but the printed narrative itself is not interested in her ability to participate meaningfully in her defense. It is interested in using her as a lesson. The machinery of justice can keep moving as long as it can say it has moved correctly. Then there is the verdict. The printed account does not linger on deliberations or dispute. It moves straight to the aftermath. After the verdict was brought in, Hannah was taken back to the jail. A visitor came to tell her what the punishment would be, and that she must prepare for death and another world. The record says she cried most of the day. Then it says she became as unconcerned as before, and resisted conversation with the person who had alarmed her. It reads as though the child's mind flickers between comprehension and self-protection. Tears, then distance. Fear, then blankness. A surge of feeling, then a retreat from the person who brings reality into the room. None of this is proof of innocence or guilt. It is proof of a child under unbearable pressure, responding in a way that does not fit the tidy moral categories the pamphlet wants to offer the public. Somewhere in those weeks, the record says, people told her she would not be hanged. No names are given. No motive is assigned. The sentence sits there like a small crack in the wall, proof that even inside the community, certainty was not absolute, or that kindness existed without the power to alter the outcome, or that adults could not bear to say plainly to a child what they had decided to do. Either way, it is difficult to imagine a more destabilizing kind of hope. The sentencing scene is where the record becomes theatrical again. When Hannah was brought back to receive sentence of death, the account says her stupidity and unconcern astonished everyone. It describes the Chief Justice as benevolent, tender, almost unable to speak. It describes spectators unable to stop themselves from crying. And it places Hannah in the center of that emotion like a fixed point that refuses to move. This is one of the most revealing passages in the case. The public cannot bear what it is doing, so it narrates itself as compassionate even while it proceeds. It turns the judge into a figure of strained mercy and the crowd into a chorus of moral grief. In this staging, the child's unreadable face becomes necessary. If the child looked like a child, terrified, pleading, clinging, then the crowd's tears would become accusation. The record cannot allow that. It needs Hannah to appear other. So the record calls her stupid. It calls her unconcerned. It makes her the strange one, so that the adults can remain the reasonable ones. Later local history uses different words but reaches for the same effect. It admits that youth and ignorance were alleviating circumstances, then dismisses them as not sufficient weight to reprieve. The phrase is cold. It reduces mercy to a measurable commodity that can be found lacking. In this way, reprieve becomes framed as an exception that must be earned, rather than a human response to a child. The sources that survive do not provide a detailed account of Hannah's family in the way a modern biography might. There is no school record offered. No clear statement of education. No testimony preserved in her own voice. What appears instead is what the community found useful, that she was born in Groton, that her mother was described as Pequot, that her mother was portrayed with contempt, that Hannah was left in a household near New London, that she lived in service, referred to as having a mistress, that she was regarded as troublesome, and that she was later said to be living with a widow near the place where the child's body was found. This is not a portrait of childhood so much as a map of control. A child who belongs to nobody in particular belongs to the town, and then belongs to the court. The printed account does not describe any formal education beyond the moral instruction it claims she lacked. It argues that her mind wanted to be properly instructed, but it does not ask why that instruction did not occur, or who was responsible for ensuring it. It names deficiency and treats deficiency as destiny. Then the weeks compress. The appendix states that about a fortnight before the execution, Hannah began to realize her danger, and grew more distressed. It describes her crying through the Tuesday and Wednesday that included the execution day. It ends the way it began, with performance, with a prayer, with the sheriff, with a child stepping into a public ending. But the courtroom sits underneath the scaffold like a foundation. A child is questioned, then brought to a body, then made to confess, then moved through grand jury and superior court, then instructed to plead, then described as strange for not emoting correctly, then declared guilty, then told she is to die, then soothed with rumor she will not, then brought back for sentence, then placed inside a story where the adults cry and the child does not. This is how the adult world makes itself comfortable enough to proceed. Chapter 5. The Jail and the Pulpit. Content note: this chapter discusses the confinement of a child, religious coercion, and the lead-up to the execution of a child. It avoids graphic detail. After the verdict, the story narrows. The court is finished with its work, and the adult world begins the slower task of making the outcome feel acceptable. This is where officials, clergy, and neighbors step in, not to change what is coming, but to shape how it will be remembered. The law has delivered a sentence. The town must now deliver meaning. Hannah is taken back to the jail. The place itself is not described in loving detail by the surviving accounts, but enough is known about 18th century confinement to see the outline: hard walls, limited light, cold that settles into stone, routine that is more about control than care. A child held in such a space is not held for rehabilitation. A child is held so that the town can keep the ending on schedule. In this period, a condemned person's days are rarely private. People come in, to look, to question, to advise, to satisfy themselves that the story is true, to witness repentance, to reassure their own conscience. A hanging is a public act. The preparation for it is often public too, even when it happens inside a cell. The record claims there were shifts in Hannah's state. It describes her as distressed when first told what would happen, then as settled again, then later as increasingly fearful as the date approached. That pattern does not need embellishment to be understood. A child's mind can move in and out of comprehension. Hope can flare. Denial can feel safer than certainty. Calm can be a kind of numbness rather than peace. This is also where the rumor appears, that some people told her she would not be hanged. The detail sits uneasily because it can be read in more than one way. It could have been a misguided kindness, offered to soothe the child without the power to make it true. It could have been ordinary gossip, passed around by adults who could not bear the reality of the sentence. It could have been an attempt to quiet her distress for the comfort of the visitors rather than for hers. Whatever the intention, the effect is cruel in its own way. A child clings to what sounds like rescue. Then the town takes that rescue away. Instruction, not comfort. The religious framing begins in earnest during these weeks. In a modern mind, the question might be whether Hannah received comfort. In the record's mind, the question is whether Hannah produced the correct spiritual performance: acknowledgement, remorse, submission, repentance. The point is not only to prepare her for death. The point is to prepare the public to watch. This is why the sermon matters. The sermon that survives in print does not simply describe a crime. It describes a failure of adults, parents and masters who did not discipline correctly, did not instruct correctly, did not control correctly. It uses Hannah as proof of what happens when authority is too soft or too absent. In that telling, Hannah's life becomes a warning label attached to other people's children. The child is turned into a lesson for adults. That choice is not accidental. It shifts responsibility away from the community's broader structures: poverty, coercive labor arrangements, racialized exclusion, and places it neatly on individual morality and household governance. It also places the crowd in a flattering role, witnesses to a necessary act, not participants in something morally complicated. Inside the jail, the minister's role is not neutral. A minister in that era is often positioned as both comforter and interrogator of the soul. The condemned person is expected to accept the narrative, that the punishment is just, that authority is right, that the community is protected by this death. Repentance is not simply personal. It is political. It reassures the onlookers that the system has worked. For a child, this is a heavy burden. The problem of unconcern. The accounts repeatedly return to one idea, that Hannah did not behave like the adults expected. The record describes moments when spectators wept and officials struggled with emotion, while Hannah appeared distant or unreadable. This is presented as proof of moral defect. It is also presented as proof of danger. The child is framed as someone who cannot be reached by ordinary feeling. But the same unconcern can be read differently without inventing anything. A child may not understand what is happening, even when told plainly. A child may understand in flashes and then retreat. A child may be frightened into stillness. A child may dissociate. A child may not have the social training to perform contrition on command. A child may have learned through experience that showing emotion invites punishment or ridicule, so emotion is swallowed down until it breaks out later. The record does not entertain these possibilities because it is not trying to understand a child. It is trying to justify a public ending. There is an additional tension that never resolves cleanly. Hannah is described at different points as unusually cunning, and also as extremely ignorant or stupid. Both descriptions serve a purpose. Cunning supports conviction and adult culpability. Ignorant supports the sermon's message that proper instruction prevents crime. In a pamphlet written to teach and to settle public nerves, a child can be both, clever enough to deserve death, and ignorant enough to prove that adults must govern harder. The contradiction is not a mistake. It is a tool. December closes in. The calendar matters here. The execution takes place on Wednesday, December 20th, 1786, close enough to the year's end that the season itself would have pressed on the town. Cold air, shorter days, a sense of closing accounts. Winter is a kind of pressure. It keeps people indoors, closer to their own thoughts, more receptive to sermons about order and judgment. A public hanging in late December lands differently than one in summer. It feels like a warning nailed to the end of the year. The accounts describe Hannah's distress intensifying in the final fortnight. It is not difficult to imagine a child running out of places to hide from the truth. What begins as a date spoken by adults becomes a shape that approaches. Each morning is closer. Each visitor is another reminder. Each prayer is another rehearsal. For an adult, the dread is unthinkable. For a child, it is also confusing. The adult world insists this is both punishment and righteousness, both horror and necessity. In that final stretch, the story becomes more obviously staged. Hannah is prepared to be seen. She is meant to appear before the community in a particular way, guided, instructed, repentant, submissive to God and to law. Even her final movements are recorded as part of a moral narrative, including small social details that make the officials appear kind. Kindness does not cancel what is happening. But the record wants it to. It wants the public to remember a child who thanked the sheriff, a child who prayed, a child who stepped into the ending with the correct posture. These details are not offered for Hannah's sake. They are offered for the crowds. The crowd's need. A hanging is not only a punishment. It is a community ritual. People attend because they fear the kind of world where a child can be murdered on a road. They attend because they fear that the law is weak. They attend because they fear that if this act is not punished publicly, the world becomes less predictable. They attend because grief demands an outlet, and punishment offers one. In that logic, Hannah's death becomes a form of reassurance. The community can tell itself that danger has been removed. It can tell itself that order has been restored. It can tell itself that the right lesson has been delivered. It can tell itself that it has done what it must. The cost of that reassurance is carried by a child. The sources that survive do not preserve Hannah's private words in any sustained, reliable way. They preserve the town's voice, instructing, describing, interpreting, concluding. This makes the final days feel strangely crowded and strangely empty at the same time, crowded with adults, empty of the child's own interior life. Chapter 6, The Day the Town Watched. Content note: this chapter discusses the execution of a child. It avoids graphic detail, but it cannot soften what the event is. The morning begins with ordinary weather and an extraordinary destination. In December, New London is cold enough to make breath visible. The air has that hard, clean edge that can make even familiar streets feel sharpened. People move early. Some are purposeful. Some are curious. Some are pulled along by the same force that pulls crowds to any public punishment, the need to see that the world has an ending to offer. The day has a schedule. There is a sermon. There is a procession. There is a place behind the old meeting house where the final act will occur. The order of events matters because order is part of what the town is trying to restore. A child has died. The community is wounded. The community wants an answer that feels firm enough to stand on. So it builds a ritual. The sermon that frames the rope. The sermon is not an accessory. It is a frame. In the surviving printed account, the minister does not speak as though the audience is gathering to witness a child die. He speaks as though the audience is gathering to be instructed. The emphasis is on duty, the duty of parents, the duty of masters, the duty of those who control children and servants. The condemned child becomes evidence in an argument about authority. This is the first sleight of hand the day performs. The sermon shifts the center of gravity away from Hannah's body and towards adult governance. It asks the crowd to look at their own households rather than at the violence of the state. It offers moral order as a soothing balm. If adults do their duty, this kind of horror can be prevented. If adults fail, the consequences are inevitable. It also offers a promise that is useful on an execution day, that what the crowd is about to see is not cruelty, but correction. The sermon's purpose is not to understand Hannah. It is to make her useful. And usefulness is a way of stripping a person down until there is only a lesson left. The child in public. After the sermon, the day moves closer to its real center. There is no gentle way to describe what it means to take a child out to be executed. Even in an era that used public death as warning, the act presses against something human. The record itself cannot avoid revealing that pressure. It describes onlookers in tears. It describes officials struggling with emotion. It describes a judge who appears tender and shaken. The public grief is not proof of mercy. It is proof of discomfort. A crowd can cry and still attend. An official can hesitate and still sign. Tears do not stop a rope from doing what it does. They can, however, help the town see itself as compassionate even while it proceeds. The emotion becomes part of the performance. Look how difficult this is, therefore it must be necessary. Hannah is expected to play her part in that performance. The record is preoccupied with her face. It wants her to look a particular way. If she is too frightened, the punishment looks brutal. If she is too calm, she looks inhuman. If she is confused, the adults look like monsters. So the narrative settles on what is safest for the system. She is described as strange, unreadable, stubbornly unconcerned, until the fear becomes undeniable at the end. This is how the adult world protects itself from the simplest interpretation, that a child is being killed. The Last Walk. The accounts that survive tend to include a few small, sharp details about the final movement from confinement to scaffold. These details recur because they are difficult to look away from. One version describes Hannah as afraid, as wanting someone to help her. Another keeps the description brief but leaves the same impression: fear has finally arrived in full, and the child's body is asked to carry it out into public. The instinct to seek help at that moment is ordinary. It is childlike. It is the most natural thing in the world. It is also the thing the day cannot allow. Public execution depends on the condemned being manageable. The condemned must be kept moving. The condemned must not disrupt the ritual. A child reaching out for help exposes the truth beneath the sermon. This is not a moral lesson. This is a human being trying not to die. So the record slides quickly past it, tucking it into a sentence and moving on. There is a line that appears in the printed account about Hannah thanking the sheriff for kindness. It reads as an attempt to keep the story tidy. It reassures the reader that the authorities were gentle, that the child was guided, that the machinery was not cruel, only firm. It is also a reminder of how narrow Hannah's world had become by that point: confined, watched, instructed, surrounded by adults with power over her body. In such a world, kindness can mean the smallest softening, less harshness than expected, a hand that does not strike, a voice that does not sneer. The record wants that line to do a job. It wants it to make the state look humane. It cannot change what is happening. The crowd's shape. The crowd is not one thing. There are people who come because they believe punishment keeps them safe. There are people who come because they cannot bear not to know. There are people who come because everyone else is going. There are people who come because grief demands somewhere to go, and the state offers a place to put it. There are also people who come because public death was entertainment as well as warning in that era, and morality did not always prevent spectacle. The crowd's presence matters because it creates the second layer of pressure on a condemned child. The first pressure is the state, the sentence, the guards, the schedule. The second pressure is the community: eyes, whispers, judgment, tears, hunger for certainty. A child placed in the center of that attention is not simply punished. She is displayed. The printed account and later retellings rarely pause to ask what it means for the youngest body in the story to be placed in front of the largest number of adult faces. It is easier to keep the story moral than to admit what the act is. The moment the ritual completes itself, the record uses the kind of language that tries to close a door. It speaks of prayer. It speaks of final words in a general way. It speaks of passing into a state that never ends. The phrasing is designed to smooth edges. There are no gory details, because the pamphlet is not pornography, it is persuasion. Even so, the absence does not soften the truth. A child is killed publicly. The town watches. The town goes home. That is the shape of it. The chapter does not linger on the physical mechanics of death, because the mechanics are not where the meaning lies. The meaning lies in what the community needed from this moment, and what it told itself while it happened. It needed the world to feel predictable again. It needed to believe danger could be removed. It needed to believe grief could be answered by punishment. It needed to believe that doing something terrible could still be called righteousness. So it gathered behind the meeting house and watched the ritual complete itself. After, the story that outlives the body. Once the execution is done, the case does not end. It changes form. The body is gone, but the story remains, and the story becomes portable. It can be reprinted, retold, cited, and reshaped. It can be used to warn other children. It can be used to scold other parents. It can be used to prove that authority must be strict. It can be used to justify harsher control over those already marginalized. This is where the sermon's true purpose becomes clear. The sermon was never only for that morning. It was meant to travel. It was meant to become a reference point. It was meant to ensure that the town's version of events survived longer than any private doubts. A printed moral narrative has an advantage over grief. Grief changes from day to day. Doubt returns when anger cools. Human memory softens or complicates. Print, however, can freeze a conclusion and hand it to the next generation as what happened. The problem is that print often preserves the voice of power, not the voice of the child. Hannah's own interior life does not survive in any reliable, sustained way. What survives is what adults said she was: cunning, ignorant, cold, wicked, repentant, unteachable, pitiable. The contradictions remain because the contradictions are useful. A child can be portrayed as clever enough to deserve death and simple enough to serve as an advertisement for stricter discipline. The story becomes a tool. What the day refuses to settle. Even within the sources that are hostile to Hannah, there are moments that refuse to sit neatly inside the moral frame. A child who wants help. A child who cries for days in the final week. A child who is told she will not be hanged. Adults who weep while proceeding. A community that needs a sermon to steady its hands. These are not ornaments. They are fissures. They suggest that the day did not feel clean, even then. They suggest that beneath the confident moral language, the town knew it was doing something that could not be easily defended without a great deal of spiritual scaffolding. The execution is presented as an ending, but it behaves like a beginning. It begins the long afterlife of the case, in which Hannah is repeatedly made into an example. It begins a pattern of retellings that often focus on shock rather than on structure. It begins the quiet erasure of everything ordinary about her childhood, leaving behind only the parts that are useful for moral theater. And it raises the question that sits under every chapter of this book: what does it mean to call a child beyond help, and then build a public ritual to prove it? The work that remains. If the case ended at the scaffold, the story would be simple. It would be cruel, but simple. The case does not end there because the record itself keeps talking. It keeps insisting. It keeps polishing its lesson. It keeps asking the reader to agree that the ending was necessary. That insistence invites a different kind of reading. Not a reading that rushes to a verdict beyond the verdict, and not a reading that pretends certainty where the record cannot offer it. A reading that watches how the story is built, what it emphasizes, what it avoids, and what it needs the reader to feel. Chapter 7. The Story That Stayed. Content note: this chapter discusses child execution, racist and ableist language in historical records, and the way harm is preserved through retelling. It contains no graphic detail. After the hanging, Hannah does not disappear. She becomes a text. This is the part of the case that can feel deceptively calm. The death is over, the crowd has dispersed, the body has been taken down, and the town has returned to its routines. Yet the story keeps moving, because it has been built to move. It is portable. It can be carried into other houses, other pulpits, other conversations, other generations. It is carried most effectively through print. The execution sermon is not simply a record of an event. It is an argument dressed as a record. It offers the reader a pre-made set of feelings: horror that needs a target, certainty that needs a conclusion, moral order that needs reinforcement. It decides what matters, what is emphasized, and what is kept out of view. It positions adults as the true audience and Hannah as the instrument used to address them. The sermon's title alone does this work. It places the killing and the punishment in a single line, with ages rendered precisely. It turns childhood into numbers, then turns those numbers into a warning. 2 children become a lesson for grown people. And then the sermon continues its most important work: it makes the town's choice feel inevitable. What the sources want. The strongest surviving narrative about Hannah's upbringing and character appears in material produced to justify an execution. This matters. A document that exists to persuade will always arrange its details differently from a document that exists to understand. The background section does not read like someone trying to locate a child inside ordinary life. It reads like someone building a case for why sympathy should be withheld. The story reaches backwards to find early incidents that can be used as foreshadowing. It describes household instability in a way that blames rather than explains. It fixes on reputation and rumor and treats them as proof. It offers cunning when it needs legal culpability and ignorance when it needs a sermon about parental duty. This is not a neutral portrait of a childhood. It is a scaffold built out of words. The record also leans on details that have an almost cinematic clarity: a piece of cloth as lure, stones placed to stage an accident, strawberry time as motive. These details are repeated because they make the story feel complete. They make it narratively satisfying. A satisfying narrative is not the same thing as a reliable one. This does not mean those details are false. It means they are useful, and usefulness is the quality that keeps a detail alive. A community remembers what serves the story it needs to tell itself. The loss of Hannah's voice. Nothing in the surviving popular account gives Hannah sustained, reliable speech. There is no clear transcript of questioning. No long statement in her own words preserved without an adult filter. No letter, no school exercise, no private reflection. What remains is a ventriloquism: Hannah's confession described by others, Hannah's demeanor interpreted by others, Hannah's nature declared by others. Even the moment that should be most personal, fear approaching death, is handled as a moral exhibit. Tears are described as evidence of finally realizing danger. Calm is described as proof of stubbornness or emptiness. A child's shifting emotional state is treated as a problem to be solved, not a human response to terror. This is how the case becomes easier to repeat. A story without a child's voice can be bent into any shape that power requires. Labels that do work. The record's language about identity is not consistent, and that inconsistency is part of the structure. Hannah is described with a racial label in one place, and her mother is described with a different identity marker in another. The shift is not treated as a confusion that needs correcting, it is treated as normal. In a colonial society, identity categories were often applied as tools that decided who was presumed credible, who was presumed suspect, who was presumed salvageable, and who could be punished with fewer objections. A child labeled as socially marginal becomes easier to fear. The same pattern appears with the language used around intellect and understanding. The sources fluctuate between portraying Hannah as frighteningly clever and depressingly simple. Both characterizations do work. Both make execution easier to sell. If she is cunning, she can be treated as fully responsible. If she is ignorant, she can be used as proof that stronger adult control is necessary. The contradiction is not an accident. It is a convenience. The afterlife of a lesson. Once the sermon exists, the case can be circulated as a warning story. It can be used in a parent's scolding. It can be used in a minister's call for stricter discipline. It can be used in a community's reassurance that the law has teeth. It can be used as a moral performance long after the original grief has cooled. In that kind of afterlife, Hannah's personhood is steadily stripped away. The questions that might make the story more complicated, questions about how the confession was obtained, what a 12-year-old could understand, how authority shaped the outcome, how poverty and placement shaped her behavior, become inconvenient. Moral theater does not want complexity. Moral theater wants certainty. A child's death becomes a caution sign, and the adults get to feel responsible rather than brutal. What later retellings inherit. Later histories and local retellings often inherit the sermon's structure even when they change the tone. Some adopt the drama. Some soften the language. Some distance themselves from the harshness by expressing pity while still repeating the same claims. But the spine remains: Hannah as abnormal child, crime as proof of moral failure, execution as regrettable necessity, community tears as evidence of humanity. The story becomes a loop. Each repetition strengthens the sense that the case is known. Each repetition makes it harder to see where the knowledge ends and the narrative begins. Over time, the retelling can become more certain than the evidence supports, simply because it has been said so often. This is how a pamphlet can outlast doubt. Print does not only preserve events. It preserves a particular interpretation of events, with the authority of ink. What cannot be recovered? There is not enough surviving material to write Hannah's childhood in full. There is no clear account of her education. No detailed record of who taught her or whether she attended school. No ordinary domestic snapshot that shows friends, favorite games, routine. Even the household she lived in are not described with the specificity a modern biography would seek. The record names only what is useful to the story, instability, reputation, placement, alleged early misconduct. This absence can tempt a writer to fill in the blanks. The absence must be respected instead. It is better to leave an honest void than to create a comforting fiction. A void is still information. It tells what the world valued enough to record, and what it did not. Hannah's ordinary life was not valued as record-worthy. Her usefulness as a warning was. The discomfort that leaks through. Even within documents designed to justify execution, discomfort leaks. A judge struggling to speak. Spectators crying. The insistence that her unconcern was shocking. The mention of rumors that she would not be hanged. The repeated emphasis on her age. The very need to publish a sermon that frames the event as necessary. These are not decorations. They are signs that the act could not be made entirely clean, even then. A community does not need to work so hard to justify something that sits easily in its conscience. The record's moral certainty is, in that sense, a kind of noise, loud enough to drown out the questions it does not want to hear. Reading against the grain. This book does not attempt to replace one certainty with another. It does not claim to know Hannah's inner thoughts. It does not claim to settle the case beyond the verdict that was already delivered. It does not claim that compassion is proof of innocence, or that discomfort is proof of wrongdoing. Instead, it reads the surviving material as a product of its time, a time when children could be treated as warnings, when the doctrine of childhood could be overridden by fear, and when colonial categories could shape credibility and punishment. Reading against the grain means noticing what the sources emphasize, and asking why. It means noticing where the narrative rushes, and asking what it is trying to move past. It means holding the printed certainty up to the light and looking for the fingerprints of power. The afterlife of Hannah's case has often been shaped by spectacle, the youngest, the rarest, the most shocking. Shock is an easy doorway into a story. It is not the whole story. Hannah was a child placed inside adult systems, households, courts, pulpits, printing presses, that spoke loudly over her. The case survives because those systems had a reason to preserve it. The work now is to read carefully enough that the preserved lesson does not become the only thing that remains. Chapter 8, Children Made Manageable. Content note: this chapter discusses child neglect, coercive labor arrangements, and the punishment of children. It contains no graphic detail. Hannah's case sits inside a world that did not treat childhood as a protected space. 18th century New England spoke often about children, and not gently. Children were talked about as souls to be saved, habits to be corrected, labor to be directed, and futures to be shaped by force if necessary. The language of care existed, but it was braided tightly to the language of control. To raise a child was also to govern a child. To instruct was also to discipline. To save could mean to break. In that world, the line between welfare and punishment was not clean. A child who was poor, unsettled, disliked, or simply inconvenient could be managed by being moved into someone else's household. It could be described as opportunity, training, rescue, moral guidance. It could also be the community quietly outsourcing responsibility. A child did not need to commit a serious crime to become subject to this kind of management. Being difficult was often enough. Being unwanted was often enough. Binding out was one of the most common tools. It turned children into contracts. It placed a child under a master's authority for years at a time. In theory, it promised food, shelter, training, and moral instruction. In reality, it depended entirely on the household receiving the child. Some masters might have been steady. Some might have been cruel. Some might have been indifferent. For the child, the arrangement often meant one thing above all: survival depended on pleasing adults. A child placed like this could become both visible and disposable at the same time. Visible, because the household watched them. Visible, because the neighbors watched them. Visible, because their mistakes were remembered. Disposable, because they lacked the social shield that comes with belonging, family standing, kin networks, a father with influence, a mother the community respected, a household that others hesitated to accuse. Hannah's background, as the record sketches it, suggests a child living near the edges of that shield. The details are thin, but the structure is clear. She is described as moved, left, placed, managed. Her story, as it survives, is full of adults deciding where she will be and what she will become. The child's will is almost never present in the telling. Even the moments that seem to include her, denials, confessions, tears, arrive already interpreted. This is not unusual for the period. It is a feature of how poor children and socially marginal children appear in archives. They are recorded not for who they are, but for the trouble they cause, the work they perform, or the lesson their suffering can be made to deliver. The childhood the law allowed. The law did not entirely ignore childhood. It had doctrines that acknowledged children were not fully formed. Yet those doctrines were fragile in practice, especially when a community was frightened. A child could be presumed less capable of criminal intent, but the presumption could be pushed aside if adults decided the child knew better. That judgment was often made by the same people who were already convinced of guilt. The standard was not a child's lived understanding, it was an adult's expectation of what a child should understand. When fear entered the room, the doctrine could become a formality. Hannah's record shows the kind of language that makes it possible to treat a child as an adult, repeated emphasis on cleverness, on craft, on artfulness. When the narrative needs her to be legally punishable, it elevates her into maturity. When the narrative needs her to serve as a warning about neglectful households, it drops her back into ignorance. Childhood becomes a lever, pulled up or down depending on what the story requires. This is how a community can speak about a child's youth and still proceed to execute the child. It can say, yes, she is young, but she is not really a child in the ways that matter. It can say, yes, she is ignorant, but ignorance itself is a reason to punish, because it proves adults must rule harder. It can say, yes, this feels dreadful, but dread is not proof it is wrong. The law can remain intact in this reasoning. The conscience can remain soothed. A society trained to suspect some children first. Hannah's identity is described inconsistently across sources, and that inconsistency tells its own truth. The colonial world had categories ready to hand, and the categories did work. When a child is labeled as other in the record, racially, socially, economically, the label is not a passive description. It is a context that shapes how quickly suspicion attaches, how much sympathy is available, and how easily harshness can be justified. Even when a community did not think of itself as unjust, it often treated the marginal child as the obvious place to store fear. Fear looks for the nearest container. Once a child is perceived as already outside the circle, already troublesome, already morally suspect, evidence does not need to do as much labor. Reputation can stand in for proof. Demeanor can stand in for intent. A confession can be treated as clean, even when it was obtained under pressure, because the community believes it simply revealed what it already knew. This is one reason the sermon's background section matters so much. It is not only providing information. It is tightening the circle. It tells the reader, in effect, this is the kind of child who does this. And once the reader agrees, the rest follows more easily. The household as courtroom. In Hannah's time, many children lived in conditions where the household functioned as a private court. A master's judgment could determine the shape of a child's days. Rules were not negotiated. Punishments were often physical. Praise and kindness were discretionary. A child's survival depended on reading adult moods correctly. If a child did not learn to perform obedience, life could become smaller, harsher, and more dangerous. In such households, lying can become complicated. A child may lie out of fear. A child may lie to avoid punishment that feels disproportionate. A child may lie because truth has never protected them. A child may lie because the adults around them lie. In a world built on hierarchy, children often learn early that honesty is safest only when the adult already wants to hear it. The record uses Hannah's alleged untruths as moral evidence. It does not treat them as social learning. It also uses theft as moral evidence, without lingering on what theft means in a poor child's life. Food, fabric, small goods, these are the kinds of things poor children are accused of taking, and they are also the kinds of things poor children often cannot access without taking. Again, the record chooses moral judgment over material explanation, because moral judgment is what allows the system to proceed cleanly. Education as absence, and absence as verdict. Little is known about Hannah's schooling in any ordinary sense. That silence is not an accident. It is the expected shape of the archive for a child like her. If Hannah had been a child with stable guardians, money, and community standing, some evidence of education might have survived. Letters, family papers, church records, mentions of schooling. For a child moved between households and described as socially marginal, the odds drop sharply. Education, when it existed, may have been informal and intermittent. church instruction, a few lessons, enough literacy to read scripture if the household valued it, or none at all. What the record does preserve is an accusation of deficiency: she was not properly instructed. This is one of the most revealing moves the narrative makes, because it blames the child for what adults failed to provide. It presents lack of instruction as proof of dangerous character, rather than as evidence of neglect, poverty, or social abandonment. It turns adult failure into child guilt. In doing so, it also serves the sermon's main purpose: to warn adults that their authority must be tighter. It creates a story where the solution to social harm is stricter control, rather than greater care. The community's need for a single body to hold the fear. When a child is murdered, a community's fear becomes intimate. It is not an abstract crime, it is an assault on the idea that children can move safely through familiar space. That fear demands an answer. It does not always demand a careful answer. It demands an answer that stops the panic. A confession provides that kind of answer, especially when the suspect is already socially vulnerable. It allows the community to close the search quickly. It allows the community to believe the threat has been located. It allows the community to redirect grief into action. It allows the community to feel that order has returned. But the speed of closure can itself become suspicious, not because it proves the wrong person was punished, but because it reveals what the community needed most. The need was not only justice. The need was certainty. And certainty is often purchased at the expense of the least protected. How a child becomes not a child. The record is fascinated by Hannah's emotional presentation. It tries to measure her by adult expectations. When she does not cry in the expected way, the narrative treats that as evidence against her. This is a familiar trap in cases involving children and disability. Adults often interpret a child's emotional mismatch as defiance, coldness, or moral emptiness. Yet children do not always show fear, grief, or shame in recognizable forms. Some go quiet. Some become rigid. Some dissociate. Some smile at the wrong time. Some appear blank because their mind is protecting them. Some appear unconcerned because they do not fully understand what is happening, or because understanding arrives in waves. The moral narrative cannot allow those possibilities, because those possibilities make the execution look like what it is: the state killing a child who may not even be fully comprehending the process. So the narrative does something practical. It withdraws childhood from her. It describes her as cunning. It describes her as unnatural. It describes her as beyond instruction. It describes her as a warning rather than a child. It builds a version of Hannah that can be punished without collapsing the adult world's image of itself. This is not only about Hannah. It is about how societies protect their moral self-image. The quiet violence of placement. Even if the later crime never occurred, the earlier structure still matters. A child moved between households, bound into service, and treated as an object of adult authority experiences a kind of slow violence, the steady erosion of safety, the absence of advocacy, the sense that life happens to them rather than with them. That violence is rarely recorded because it is ordinary. It is not scandal. It is not headline. It is not a sermon's focus. Yet it shapes everything. It shapes how a child speaks to authority. It shapes whether a child believes anyone will protect them. It shapes whether confession becomes a survival tool. It shapes whether the child can even imagine a future beyond the next day's demands. The record does not show Hannah dreaming of anything. It shows adults measuring her for usefulness. That is, in itself, a kind of biography. What Hannah's case reveals when it is widened. When Hannah is treated only as an individual puzzle, good or evil, guilty or innocent, the case stays trapped in spectacle. When Hannah is placed inside her world, child labor, binding out, racial categorization, poverty, uneven education, harsh discipline, public punishment, the case begins to speak differently. It becomes less about a singular monstrous child and more about a system trained to manage certain children through control, and trained to resolve fear by sacrificing the least protected body available. This does not erase the victim. It does not erase grief. It does not remove moral responsibility. It does, however, refuse the easy story. It refuses the idea that the hanging can be understood without the social machinery that made it possible to imagine a child as an appropriate object of public death. The question the system does not ask. The system asks, did she do it? The system asks, can we prove it enough to punish? The system asks, How do we make the punishment feel righteous? It does not ask, what happened to this child before any crime was committed? It does not ask, who failed her, and how? It does not ask, what would care have looked like, if care had been available? Those questions sit outside the court's purpose and outside the sermon's purpose. Yet they are the questions that remain when the ritual ends and the printed lesson begins to travel. Chapter 9. The example they needed. Content note: this chapter discusses the execution of a child, the use of violence as public warning, and the way fear is used to justify harsher control over children. No graphic detail is included. Hannah's death did not end the town's anxiety. It redirected it. A child's murder on a public road tears a hole in the everyday story a community tells itself, about safety, about order, about children moving through familiar spaces without consequence. A verdict can close a court case, but it does not automatically repair that hole. Something else is required, a narrative strong enough to hold fear in place, to stop it leaking into every corner of daily life. This is where Hannah becomes the example. The printed sermon does not merely describe what happened. It offers an explanation for why such a thing could happen, and then it offers a solution that feels simple enough to implement: stricter adult control, duty, discipline, governance. The implied promise is that if adults tighten their grip, on children, on servants, on households, then disorder will not return. It is a comforting promise, because it puts the power back in adult hands. It also shifts the focus. Instead of asking how grief can coexist with uncertainty, or how a child could be moved through accusation into execution, the story becomes a warning about what happens when children are not governed hard enough. The community is invited to see itself not as the agent of a killing, but as the audience of a necessary lesson. A public execution does not only punish the condemned, it trains everyone else. Fear as fuel. After a violent crime, communities often reach for an explanation that prevents the unbearable thought that horror can arrive without a clear cause, without a clear pattern, without a clear way to stop it. A moral explanation offers that pattern. If Hannah can be framed as the result of poor discipline, poor instruction, weak authority, then other adults can feel protected by their own compliance. They can say, this happened there, because those people failed. It will not happen here, because we will not fail. This is not a small psychological comfort. It is a survival mechanism for a community that has been shaken. The danger is that the mechanism needs a villain shaped just so, and a solution shaped just so. Hannah is made to fit the villain shape. Her alleged cunning becomes proof she is not a child in the ordinary sense. Her alleged ignorance becomes proof she is dangerous without strict guidance. Her unstable upbringing becomes proof she cannot be trusted. The story gathers these elements and ties them into a knot that feels neat enough to hold on to. Then the knot is offered to every parent and master as a warning. Fear becomes policy at the household level. What parents and masters really means. The sermon's phrasing matters, parents and masters. It is not only speaking to mothers and fathers. It is speaking to the entire hierarchy that controlled children and young people, employers, household heads, those who held apprentices and bound children, those who decided when a child ate, slept, worked, and was punished. In that social order, the household is the first court. It is also the first prison. A story like Hannah's becomes useful to that hierarchy. It can be used to justify harsher discipline in the name of prevention. It can be used to rationalize stricter supervision. It can be used to excuse violence done for their own good. It can be used to treat disobedience as a threat rather than a stage of development. It can be used to frame a child's distress as manipulation, a child's silence as guilt, a child's difference as danger. The example does not stay in the courtroom. It travels into kitchens and barns and bedrooms and schoolrooms and churches, carried on adult voices that insist they are protecting the young while tightening their control. The condemned child becomes an instrument for governing other children. How an example erases alternatives. The record's greatest insistence is that the ending was necessary. That insistence performs a quiet kind of violence. It erases the idea that other responses were possible. It erases hesitation. It erases ambiguity. It erases mercy as a legitimate option. In doing so, it also erases responsibility. If the hanging was necessary, then the adults who carried it out are relieved of the burden of choice. They become mere executors of inevitability. They can be tender and still proceed. They can weep and still proceed. The story gives them that permission. But the very need for permission suggests that, underneath, choice was present. A child was tried. A child was sentenced. A child was executed. These are actions undertaken by adults, not weather that rolled in over the harbor. The narrative's insistence on necessity is a way of smoothing over that agency. And once a community learns to smooth over agency, it becomes easier to repeat. The children who pay for the lesson. The cruel irony of warning stories is that they are rarely used to create gentleness. They are used to create compliance. When Hannah is used as an example, the children most affected are not the children who are safe inside wealth and status. The children most affected are the ones already close to the edge, the poor, the placed, the bound out, the unwanted, the children whose families are already scrutinized and judged, the children whose identities are already treated as suspicious. A warning story does not distribute discipline evenly. It concentrates it where power is weakest. So Hannah's afterlife does not only belong to memory. It belongs to practice, the tightening of household rules, the sharpening of punishments, the narrowing of tolerance for misbehavior, the quickness with which adults interpret difference as threat. For a child like Hannah, already described as troublesome, already classed as marginal, this is a trap that closes before any crime occurs. Once the community has a story that says this kind of child becomes dangerous, the child cannot easily escape the category. A category can function like a sentence. The way the record recruits the reader. The printed narrative does not simply tell, it recruits. It invites the reader to become the kind of adult who responds correctly, shocked by the crime, satisfied by the punishment, determined to discipline the young, reassured that strictness is love. It also quietly discourages other responses. Doubt becomes softness, compassion becomes naivety, questions become disrespect. To push against the narrative is to risk being seen as someone who excuses evil. This is how moral theater protects itself. It makes the reader complicit in the lesson, and then it offers that complicity as righteousness. What is left out to keep the example clean? To keep Hannah as a usable warning, certain things must remain blurry or absent. Her ordinary days. Her education, if any. Any kindnesses she received. Any kindnesses she offered. Any complex feelings that do not align with the sermon's demands. Any possibility that a confession could be shaped under pressure. Any possibility that a child might not fully comprehend the machinery moving around her. These omissions are not minor. They are the cost of turning a person into an example. The example cannot be too human, or the lesson breaks. The uncomfortable question beneath the lesson. The sermon's message is clear: govern children more strictly, and the world will be safer. But the case itself suggests a different question, one the record does not want to ask. What happens when a society's primary tool for shaping children is fear? Fear of punishment, fear of shame, fear of exclusion, fear of the rope. If fear is the tool, then fear will also be the inheritance. Children raised under fear learn compliance, not necessarily conscience. They learn to hide. They learn to appease. They learn to perform. They learn sometimes to stop trusting the adults who claim to protect them. The story uses Hannah to argue for stricter control. It does not consider that control without care can produce the very instability it claims to prevent. A child made manageable is not the same as a child made safe. The case as template. Over time, Hannah's story becomes a template, a quick, sharp tale that can be told in a few sentences to produce a desired effect. A child killed a child. A child was hanged. Let that be a warning. The template is powerful because it is short. It doesn't require the listener to sit with uncertainty. It doesn't require a listener to hold grief and complexity at the same time. It doesn't require anyone to look closely at how the confession was obtained, or how social vulnerability shapes suspicion, or how an adult legal system can crush a child. The template asks only for obedience. And obedience is what authority always wants from a warning story. What remains after the example is stripped away. If Hannah is removed from the lesson for a moment, if the sermon's recruitment is set aside, what remains is still stark. A child died. A child was accused. A child was questioned. A child confessed under conditions that deserve scrutiny. A child was tried in an adult court. A child was sentenced to die. A child was executed in public. The story can be turned into an example, but it cannot be made harmless. Chapter 10. What had to be true? Content note: this chapter discusses the death of a child, the execution of a child, and the ways communities justify punishment. It includes discussion of coercion and power. No graphic detail is included. A community does not carry a child to a scaffold without building a story strong enough to hold the weight. That story has to do more than explain a death. It has to steady hands. It has to quiet doubt. It has to make neighbors feel safe again in their own streets. It has to make grief bearable. It has to make the law look like protection rather than force. In Hannah Ocuish's case, the surviving record shows that work being done in real time. It does not read like a document that happened to survive. It reads like a document designed to survive. It is, above all, a document that insists. The difference between grief and certainty. Grief is messy. It has no straight line. It erupts, recedes, returns. It turns people inward and then outward. It can coexist with confusion. It can admit that the world does not always make sense. Certainty is cleaner. Certainty gives grief somewhere to go. After a child's death, certainty becomes a kind of shelter. It offers a clear enemy, a clear explanation, a clear ending. It removes the terror of randomness. It tells the community, the danger has a name, and it can be removed. When certainty takes hold, it does not always wait for careful proof. It recruits whatever supports it: reputation, demeanor, rumor, labels, prior incidents, the community's existing map of who belongs and who does not. Once those things align, the rest can feel inevitable. A child becomes a container. One of the hardest truths to sit with is how often a vulnerable person becomes the place a community stores its fear. The record around Hannah does not simply describe her. It positions her. It draws a boundary around her that places her outside ordinary childhood and outside ordinary sympathy. It tells the reader again and again that she is not only guilty, but fundamentally different. This is how a child becomes manageable. Not by being understood, but by being categorized. A categorized child does not need nuance. A categorized child can be handled through standard procedures. A categorized child can be turned into a lesson. A categorized child can be carried to an ending without the adults collapsing under the moral strain. And once a child is used as a container, every detail is interpreted to fit. If she appears calm, it becomes coldness. If she appears confused, it becomes stupidity. If she denies, it becomes deceit. If she confesses, it becomes proof. If she cries, it becomes finally realized guilt. If she does not cry in the right way, it becomes monstrousness. There is no room left for ordinary child responses, because ordinary child responses would disrupt the story's purpose. Confession as closure. The record leans heavily on confession, and not only because confession is evidence. Confession is closure. A confession ends the search. It resolves the panic. It gives the community a sentence it can say out loud: she did it. And once that sentence has been spoken enough times, it begins to feel like memory rather than conclusion. But a confession is also one of the most vulnerable forms of evidence when a child is involved. Not because children always lie, and not because children are always innocent, but because children are highly responsive to authority, to fear, to suggestion, to the desire to make a terrifying situation stop. They are also responsive to narrative. A child can be guided into a story simply by the shape of the questioning and the reactions of adults in the room. The record itself describes a turning point that should never be treated lightly. Hannah is questioned, denies, is taken to the body, and then breaks and confesses. That sequence is not neutral. It is confrontation, shock, pressure, and adult power concentrated into a moment. It may produce truth. It may produce compliance. It may produce a mixture of both. The record does not pause on that ambiguity, because ambiguity is what the town cannot afford. The town needs confession to be clean. So the record treats it as clean. Childhood as a hinge the adults can move. The law of the period had a concept of childhood. It was not the modern concept, but it existed, a recognition that very young children could not form criminal intent in the same way adults could, and that older children might still be treated differently unless their understanding could be shown. Yet the record's language is carefully built to swing that hinge towards adult culpability. Hannah is repeatedly described in terms that elevate her: artful, cunning, unusually knowing. That language does not just make her unsympathetic. It makes her punishable. At the same time, the record also describes her as ignorant and poorly instructed, because that description serves the sermon's purpose. It allows the author to scold parents and masters and insist that stricter governance would prevent future harm. A child can be both in the narrative because both are useful. The contradiction is not resolved because it is not meant to be resolved. It is meant to carry the reader across the gap between child and execution, without the reader stopping to stare into the gap. The moral laundering of violence. Public punishment relies on a kind of moral laundering. It takes an act that would be plainly called violence in any other context and reframes it as necessity, safety, righteousness, duty. It surrounds the act with prayer and order and solemn words. It casts officials as reluctant, tender, even tearful. It describes spectators as distressed but accepting. In that framing, the violence becomes almost invisible. It is still there, but it is wrapped in meaning until it can be watched. The sermon is part of this laundering. It asks the crowd to look at themselves as learners rather than as participants. It tells them that their discomfort is evidence of their goodness. It assures them that the execution is not cruelty, but instruction. This is how a community can attend a hanging and still feel moral. It places the moral focus not on the condemned child's body, but on adult duty and adult order. The crowd becomes the subject. Hannah becomes the object. The need to believe the system is kind. The record includes small details that function like soft padding, a word of kindness, a suggestion of gentle handling, a line about gratitude offered to an official. These details do not exist for Hannah. They exist for the adults who must live with what they have done. They allow the town to say, "We were not brutal. We were humane." They allow officials to say, "We did our duty with tenderness." They allow the community to say, "This was hard for us too." It is not that kindness never existed in the jail corridor. It is that kindness, in this context, does not change the structure. Kindness does not alter the sentence. Kindness does not return a child to life. Kindness, at most, smooths the machinery so it can keep moving. The system can appear gentle and still be merciless. Identity and the ease of suspicion. The record's shifting labels around Hannah's identity are not merely an archival annoyance. They are a sign of the world she lived in, a world where categories were imposed, and categories shaped outcomes. A child marked as socially marginal enters any crisis already weighed down. Suspicion attaches faster. Sympathy attaches slower. A child without a protective network is easier to isolate. A child perceived as other is easier to treat as the source of danger rather than as someone living under danger. This does not prove anything about guilt. It proves something about vulnerability. It shows how a community's existing hierarchies can become part of an investigation, part of a trial, part of a sentence, without ever being named as such. The strange role of tears. The record's emphasis on adult tears is revealing. Tears appear as a kind of certificate. They certify that the adults are decent people. They certify that the court is benevolent. They certify that the town is not bloodthirsty. They certify that the execution is not done lightly. Yet tears can do a quieter job as well. They can soothe conscience without changing behaviour. They can allow a person to experience themselves as compassionate while still supporting something cruel. They can turn moral discomfort into self-congratulation. Look how much this affects me, therefore I must be good. In the record, the adult's emotion is foreground and the child's interior life is not. Even in the moments where Hannah's distress is mentioned, it is filtered through adult interpretation and moral framing. The child's fear becomes another element in the story the adults require. What had to be true for the ending to happen? For the execution to proceed, several things had to be treated as true, whether or not the record can truly prove them. That the confession was reliable in the way the community needed it to be. That the child understood wrongfulness in a way that made adult punishment appropriate. That the community's fear justified speed and finality. That mercy would endanger others. That killing a child could restore order. That the law, by definition, produces justice. That the story printed afterwards was the same as the truth that happened. These are not simply beliefs. They are supports. Without them, the crowd behind the meeting house could not stand where it stood. The question that remains under every page. If the case is approached only as a moral tale, the ending can be made to feel tidy. If the case is approached as a human event, the tidy feeling is harder to keep. A 6-year-old is dead. A 12-year-old is dead. Adults decided the second death would answer the first. That decision sits at the center of the case like a stone. The record tries to cover the stone with sermon language, with character descriptions, with warnings to parents and masters, with talk of civilization and duty. The covering is thick, but it does not change what the stone is. The question that remains is not only what Hannah did. It is what the community needed to believe about Hannah in order to do what it did. Chapter 11, Holding Two Truths. Content note: this chapter discusses the death of a child, the execution of a child, and the emotional impact on families and communities. It contains no graphic detail. There is a temptation, when writing a case like this, to choose a side that makes the story easier to hold. To lean into outrage and let it do the work. To lean into certainty and let it quiet the discomfort. To lean into pity and let it soften everything that is sharp. None of those approaches is honest enough. This story begins with Eunice Bowles, 6 years old, walking a familiar path and not reaching her destination. It ends with Hannah Ocuish, 12 years old, brought into public view to be killed by the state. Between those 2 points sits a community that needed an answer quickly, and a record that worked hard to make that answer feel clean. To write about Hannah without erasing Eunice is a moral requirement. To write about Eunice without treating Hannah as disposable is also a moral requirement. This is what the case demands: two truths held together, without one being used to silence the other. The grief that does not need persuasion. The death of a child does not require a sermon to be real. It does not require a pamphlet to be vivid. It does not require a moral lesson to be meaningful. It does not require a villain to be devastating. When a child is murdered, the grief is immediate and total. It spreads beyond the family because children belong, in a quiet cultural sense, to everyone's sense of the future. The community experiences the loss as a rupture in what it wants to believe about itself. That rupture can produce compassion and panic at the same time. It is likely that, in 1786, many people in New London felt genuine sorrow for Eunice Bowles. It is also likely that they felt something darker, fear that if it happened once, it could happen again, and that the world might not be as legible as they thought. That fear does not excuse what followed, but it helps explain the speed with which the town moved towards punishment. A frightened community tends to prefer closure over complexity. The child the record keeps trying not to see. Hannah is easier to treat as an idea than as a child. The record encourages that. It gives her a set of labels, a set of claims about character, and a set of interpretations about what her face and body meant. It pushes her away from ordinary childhood, away from recognizable vulnerability, away from the messy interior life that might make the public ending unbearable to watch. When Hannah is described as cold, cunning, or beyond instruction, the reader is being coached. Coached to feel less. Coached to judge faster. Coached to accept the rope. This coaching is part of how public punishment becomes socially possible. But the case keeps refusing to stay inside the coaching. Because a child is still a child, no matter how the record categorizes her. A child can be guilty and still be a child. A child can be difficult and still be a child. A child can be damaged and still be a child. A child can have done something terrible and still be a child. The record's insistence on making Hannah not a child is, in itself, evidence of how hard the town had to work to proceed. Why the harm cannot be balanced away. Holding two truths is not the same thing as balancing them like scales. This is not a matter of deciding which death matters more. Both deaths matter. That is the point. Eunice's family lost a child who should have been safe. Hannah's life was ended by adults who decided execution was an acceptable response to a child's crime. The sorrow in the first does not cancel the sorrow in the second. The existence of victims does not make the accused less human. The existence of the accused humanity does not minimize the victim. Any telling that makes one of these bodies disappear is a telling that has failed. The ethical trap of spectacle. The case has survived partly because it is shocking. A child executed for murder is rare enough to become famous. Rarity draws retelling. Retelling draws certainty. Certainty draws simplification. The story becomes an object that can be handled quickly. This is the trap. Shock makes the story easy to sell, but it also makes it easy to distort. Spectacle pushes writers towards extremes. The demon child who proves evil can appear early. Or the pure victim child who proves the system was wicked. Both extremes flatten reality. They also protect the reader from the thing that is hardest to accept, that ordinary people can participate in extraordinary harm when fear, grief, and authority align. The crowd behind the meeting house likely included neighbors who believed they were doing the right thing. That is not comfort. It is warning. The absence of Hannah's education as a moral problem. One of the most disturbing features of the case is how little is known about Hannah's ordinary development. There is no clear record of schooling. No preserved evidence of literacy. No consistent account of stable care. What survives is a moral narrative that blames a lack of instruction while refusing to examine who failed to provide it. This is not a small archival gap. It is part of the system's logic. A community that moves children between households, that binds them out, that treats them as labor and burden, then claims those children are dangerous because they are not properly instructed, is a community laundering its own neglect into moral judgment. And once neglect becomes judgment, punishment becomes easier. It becomes possible to say, she was not taught, therefore she is wicked, rather than, she was not taught, therefore we failed her. The record chooses the first. This book refuses to let that choice stand unexamined. The question of disability without diagnosis. Modern readers often reach for diagnosis as a way to make sense of Hannah's unconcern or the record's references to ignorance. Diagnosis can feel like clarity. It can also become another kind of story imposed on a child who cannot consent to it. It is not possible to know, with ethical certainty, what Hannah's cognitive profile was. The sources are not clinical. They are moral. They describe what the observers found useful to describe, and they describe it through the biases of their time. What can be said responsibly is that the case raises questions about capacity and comprehension that the system did not meaningfully explore, and that the system's failure to explore those questions is part of what makes this case so unsettling. Whether Hannah was disabled or simply traumatized, neglected, frightened, and socially marginal, the essential point remains: the adults did not organize themselves around care. They organized themselves around conclusion. What it means to write this now. Writing this story in the present is not simply an act of recounting. It is an act of choosing not to repeat the old machinery. The old machinery turns Hannah into an example and calls that righteousness. The old machinery turns Eunice into a symbol and calls that closure. The old machinery turns adult judgment into inevitability and calls that justice. This book refuses to let the machinery run unchallenged. It names the record as persuasion. It treats certainty as something to be tested rather than swallowed. It acknowledges grief without using it as permission for cruelty. It acknowledges the possibility of harm done by Hannah without denying the harm done to Hannah. Holding two truths is a discipline. It requires resisting the urge to make the story neat. The hardest sentence in the case. It can be said plainly: a 6-year-old was killed. A 12-year-old was killed. The adults who wept did not stop the second death. The sermon that warned did not undo the first. If this chapter ends on discomfort, it is because discomfort is honest here. The story is not meant to be consumed like a ghost tale. It is meant to be understood as a collision between childhood and power, between fear and certainty, between grief and the state's desire to demonstrate control. Chapter 12, Reading Without Repeating. Content note: this chapter discusses child death, child punishment, and the ethics of retelling. No graphic detail is included. A case like Hannah Ocuish's arrives already shaped, not only by what happened in 1786, but by what was printed afterwards, what was repeated later, and what modern readers have been trained to expect from true crime: a clear villain, a decisive motive, an ending that feels like order. The difficulty is that the sources that survive were built to make the ending feel orderly. They were not built to protect a child, understand a child, or preserve a child's ordinary life. They were built to justify the state's decision, to steady a shaken community, and to offer a lesson that could travel. So the first task is not to ask, what do these documents say? It is to ask, what are these documents trying to do? A record is not the same as a window. The execution sermon reads like certainty because certainty is its purpose. It selects details that support its conclusion. It arranges Hannah's childhood into a moral argument. It treats rumor and reputation as character evidence. It interprets a child's demeanor as proof. It turns ambiguity into righteousness by moving quickly past the places where doubt might grow. That does not make the text worthless. It makes the text revealing, not just about Hannah, but about the adults who needed this story to be told in this way. A sermon printed for an execution is not a neutral account. It is a community speaking to itself, telling itself what it must believe in order to live with what it has done. The record, in other words, is a mirror. It reflects fear, hierarchy, prejudice, and the moral machinery that allows violence to be presented as instruction. It reflects a world where certain children were managed through placement and discipline, and where the failure to provide care could be rewritten as proof that a child was unteachable. To read the record as a window is to let it do its intended work. To read the record as a mirror is to see the fingerprints. The silence is part of the story. There is no comfortable way to say it. Hannah's ordinary life is missing because it was not considered worth keeping. There is no clear schooling history. No stable family portrait. No sustained voice preserved in her own words. The archive holds her when she is being classified, moved, accused, questioned, sentenced, used. This absence is not a small inconvenience. It is the shape of social value. A child with wealth, kinship protection, and recognized status leaves traces. A child without those protections is more likely to appear only when she is in trouble, or when adults need her story for their own purposes. The silence becomes a form of evidence, evidence of how the world saw her. A careful telling does not fill that silence with invented detail. It marks it, holds it, and refuses to pretend that the gaps are harmless. How language can do violence twice. The historical record uses terms that are cruel, racialized, and moralizing. Some of those terms are not repeated here because repeating them without necessity can reenact what they were designed to do: reduce a human being to a category, justify unequal treatment, turn a child into an object. Where the record's language must be discussed, it is approached as part of the system, not as a description to be adopted. The goal is not to sanitize history into comfort, but to refuse to reproduce its contempt as a narrator's tone. This is especially important in a case that has been repeatedly retold as spectacle. A sensational phrase can make a chapter feel vivid. It can also make a child disappear. The temptation of diagnosis, and the ethics of restraint. Modern readers often sense something in the record's descriptions of Hannah: confusion, flatness, emotional mismatch, unpredictability. It is tempting to name those things in modern clinical terms, because naming can feel like understanding. But diagnosis at this distance can become another story imposed on a child who never consented to the telling. What can be done responsibly is narrower and still important: to acknowledge that the case raises questions about comprehension, capacity, and vulnerability that the adult system did not meaningfully examine. To note that the record's certainty about Hannah's nature is moral language, not clinical insight. To recognize that a child's emotion is not a reliable measure of guilt or understanding, especially under extreme pressure. The restraint is not a refusal to see disability. It is a refusal to claim certainty the sources cannot support. What a careful reader can hold. A careful reader can hold these things at once. A 6-year-old's death is an unbearable harm. A 12-year-old's execution is an unbearable harm. A community can feel grief and still act harshly. A court can follow procedure and still be unjust to a child. A confession can be central to a case and still be vulnerable to pressure. A printed narrative can be persuasive and still contain fragments of truth. Identity and status can shape suspicion, even when no one names it openly. Adults can weep and still proceed. Holding these together does not produce a neat conclusion. It produces honesty. Refusing the old story shapes. Most retellings of Hannah's case fall into one of two shapes. The first is the monster child shape, a chilling rarity offered as proof of innate evil. The second is the pure victim shape, a child crushed by injustice, with the victim of the original crime fading into the background. Both shapes simplify because simplification is easier to sell. This book refuses both shapes. It refuses to turn Eunice into a prop for outrage. It refuses to turn Hannah into a prop for moral theater. It refuses to let the sermon's certainty become the reader's certainty by default. Instead, it treats the case as what it is: a collision between childhood and power, fear and authority, social vulnerability and public punishment. What changes when the accused is a child? When adults commit violence, the record tends to ask what kind of person they were, what drove them, what pattern can be found. When a child is accused, the record often skips straight to moral panic. This child is wrong, this child is dangerous, this child must be made an example. A child threatens the adult story of the world. If children can do terrible things, the world is frightening. If children can be punished like adults, the world is also frightening. To manage that double fear, communities often tell a story that removes the child from childhood altogether. They call the child unnatural, cunning, beyond help. They turn the child into an exception, a rarity, a warning. That story protects the adult's sense of themselves. It also makes it easier to harm a child while calling it justice. The work of witness. This book is not a verdict. The court already delivered one. This book is a form of witness, a refusal to let the printed moral lesson be the only voice that survives, and a refusal to let shock be the only reason the story is remembered. It is an attempt to read slowly, to name what is known and what is not, and to treat the child at the center as a child even when the record tries to strip that away. Witness does not fix what happened. It changes what is permitted to happen in the telling. It changes how the reader is invited to stand, not as a spectator behind a meeting house, not as a consumer of a warning story, but as someone willing to notice the machinery, how it was built, who it served, and what it cost. What remains unresolved, and why that matters. There are questions this book cannot answer with certainty. How much Hannah understood at each stage. What her daily life truly looked like before July 1786. What was said in the exact words of the questioning. What pressures were applied beyond what the sources admit. What private doubts existed in the town, beyond the hints that leak through. Leaving these questions unresolved is not a failure. It is a refusal to pretend that the archive is kinder than it is. A story that admits what it cannot know is safer than a story that fills every gap with confidence, especially when the person who cannot speak back is a child. Chapter 13. What the case leaves behind. Content note: this chapter discusses child death, child punishment, and the long effects of public violence on communities. No graphic detail is included. There is no ending that makes this story feel right. The record wants one. The sermon provides one. The court enforces one. The crowd witnesses one. But the feeling of wrongness remains, because the case contains something that cannot be reconciled by tidy moral language. The state killed a child in response to the killing of a child. If the story is left there, it becomes only shock. If it is read carefully, it becomes something else, a set of traces that show how a community handles fear, how power protects itself, and how certain children become easier to sacrifice when the world demands reassurance. This is what the case leaves behind. The lesson the sermon offers, and the lesson the case actually teaches. The sermon's lesson is direct: parents and masters must govern children more strictly, or chaos will follow. It is a lesson that flatters authority. It promises that control can prevent horror. It suggests that society remains stable as long as adults hold the reins tightly enough. Yet the case itself teaches a more unsettling lesson. It shows that control can become cruelty when it is not bound to care. It shows that the desire for order can override the recognition of childhood. It shows that instruction can be used as moral cover for punishment, and that the language of duty can hide the language of power. If the community truly believed instruction prevented harm, the question becomes unavoidable: where was the instruction when Hannah was being moved and managed and placed? Who was responsible for her well-being? Who claimed authority over her life without providing protection? The sermon points outward: you must do better, while the case points inward: we did not do better, and we blame the child for it. The cost of turning a child into a warning. When Hannah is turned into an example, the town gains something, a story that feels firm enough to stand on. But the town also loses something, even if it does not name the loss: the ability to see certain children as fully human. A warning story trains adults to watch for signs of badness in children rather than signs of need. It trains adults to interpret distress as manipulation and difference as danger. It trains adults to believe harshness is protection. This training does not remain in the past. It echoes forward, because the pattern is durable. Whenever a community is frightened, it becomes tempting to choose the quickest form of safety: identify a threat, remove it, display the removal, call the display justice. The display is meant to calm the public. It can also harden the public. The way vulnerability becomes proof. Hannah's case reveals how easily vulnerability is reinterpreted as evidence against the vulnerable. A child with unstable care becomes untrustworthy. A child with limited education becomes ignorant in a moral sense. A child whose emotional responses are mismatched becomes cold or monstrous. A child with shifting demeanor becomes cunning. A child without strong advocates becomes obviously guilty. These are not truths about children. They are habits of interpretation in systems built for adult power. The case shows how quickly a community can take traits that should trigger support and use them to justify punishment instead. Once that conversion happens, need into guilt, the child's fate becomes easier to accept. And once it is easy to accept for one child, it becomes easier to accept again. The archive as a second scaffold. The hanging is a scaffold of wood. The record becomes a scaffold of words. A pamphlet can do what rope cannot. It can keep punishing, long after the body is gone. It can keep reducing. It can keep recruiting new readers into the same moral certainty. It can keep making Hannah into the kind of child who deserved what happened. This is one reason retelling matters. A careless retelling recreates the scaffold. It repeats the sermon's certainty, the moralising language, the neat motive, the idea that the ending was inevitable. It turns the reader into the crowd again, watching, judging, agreeing. A careful retelling refuses that position. It looks at the scaffold and asks who built it. What remains unknown is part of the reckoning. The gaps in Hannah's story are not just missing information. They are evidence of what was not valued. A child's daily life was not preserved. A child's education was not recorded. A child's private voice was not protected. A child's comprehension was not tested in a way that would survive as proof. What was preserved instead were the elements that made punishment easier: background framed as moral decay, identity framed as otherness, behavior framed as innate wickedness, demeanor framed as evidence. This imbalance in the archive is itself part of the case's legacy. It reminds the present that the past did not record everyone equally, and that the stories we inherit are often shaped by the interests of those who held power. To read Hannah's case honestly is to accept that the archive is not merely incomplete, it is biased in its very shape. The question of mercy. The record tends to treat mercy as something that must be earned. That framing is powerful and dangerous. When mercy is treated as a reward for the right kind of person, then those who are socially marginal, poor, racially categorized, disabled, disliked, are less likely to qualify. Their failure to perform the expected emotions becomes another reason to deny mercy. Their lack of polish becomes proof they are undeserving. The child becomes trapped inside adult expectations of how a child should behave under terror. Hannah's case presses a harder question: what does mercy look like when the accused is a child? Not mercy as denial of harm, and not mercy as sentimental avoidance of responsibility, but mercy as recognition of childhood itself. Recognition that a child's mind is not an adult mind, that a child's life has not yet had the chance to become anything else, and that the adult world has obligations that do not vanish in the face of fear. The community in 1786 could not, or would not, hold that question long enough to let it matter. The record is, in part, an attempt to make that refusal feel righteous. What the case asks of the present. This story is not only about one town behind one meeting house. It is about what happens whenever systems choose spectacle over care. Whenever the public is told that harshness equals safety. Whenever difference is treated as threat. Whenever a child's behavior is read only through punishment. Whenever authority needs a body to prove it is strong. The specifics change. The machinery is recognizable. Hannah's case asks the present to recognize that machinery early, before it reaches a rope, or any modern equivalent of irreversible harm. It asks for skepticism towards tidy narratives that justify cruelty. It asks for attention to how vulnerability is interpreted. It asks for care in how stories are told, especially when the person at the center cannot speak back. A quiet accounting. In the end, what remains is not a moral lesson that can be printed cleanly. What remains is an accounting of costs. A family lost Eunice Bowles. A community lost a sense of safety. A child named Hannah Ocuish lost her life. The town gained a story that made itself feel orderly again. But order purchased this way is brittle. It relies on fear. It relies on sacrifice. It relies on turning a child into something less than a child. That is what the case leaves behind, not only tragedy, but a map of how tragedy can be used. Conclusion: a name, not a warning. Hannah Ocuish enters the record as an ending. A child carried through accusation, confession, trial, sentence, sermon, and public death, then sealed into print as a lesson for other people's households. The documents that survive do not preserve her to understand her. They preserve her to justify what was done, and to make sure the community's version of necessity outlives any private doubt. That is why this story has traveled. Not because the record is complete, and not because it is clean, but because it is useful. It can be used to frighten children into obedience. It can be used to praise authority for being firm. It can be used to reassure adults that harshness is protection. It can be used to keep a certain kind of child outside the circle of sympathy, poor, placed, categorized, and already treated as suspect. This book has resisted that use. It has resisted the easy shapes, the monster child story that makes execution feel like common sense, and the pure victim story that lets the original victim fade into the background. It has refused to turn Eunice Bowles into a prop, and it has refused to turn Hannah into a symbol. It has held both deaths as real, and it has treated the gap between them, the adult's decision to answer one child's death with another, as the central moral fact that cannot be sermonized away. There are things this book cannot do. It cannot recover Hannah's ordinary days. It cannot provide the schooling record that was never kept, or the stable family portrait that the archive did not value enough to preserve. It cannot reproduce her voice in full, because the world that condemned her did not protect her words. Those absences matter. They are not empty space. They are evidence of who the past considered worth recording. What can be done, what has been done here, is to read the surviving material without surrendering to its certainty. To notice what the sources emphasize, what they minimize, what they moralize, and what they need the reader to believe. To name where a confession is treated as closure rather than questioned as a child's speech under pressure. To see how identity labels and social vulnerability can shape suspicion and punishment without being openly acknowledged. To recognize how adult tears can coexist with adult violence, and how a crowd can feel compassionate while still watching a child die. In the end, the most honest sentence is still the hardest one. A 6-year-old was killed. A 12-year-old was killed. The town did not simply witness the second death. It organized it, framed it, preached it, printed it, and carried it forward as a warning. This conclusion offers something smaller, and deliberately so, a refusal to let Hannah be reduced again. Not a caution sign. Not a moral example. Not a category. Not a spectacle. A name. A child in a system that valued order over care, certainty over humility, and authority over the messy truth that children are children even when adults are frightened. If this book leaves the reader unsettled, that is not a flaw to correct. It is the appropriate response to what happened behind the old meeting house. Comfort, in this case, is too close to the work the sermon was trying to do. The better ending is a question carried forward, not a lesson nailed shut. When a society decides a child is beyond help, what does that decision reveal about the child, and what does it reveal about the society? And now that the story is being told again, what will be refused this time?